A 3-year-old on a crowded Tokyo subway suddenly goes unnervingly quiet, staring blankly ahead, their tiny fists tightly gripping their mother's coat. A Western observer might breathe a sigh of relief, thinking, "Great, they are behaving." But the Japanese mother immediately shifts her posture. She places a firm, gentle hand on the child's back, swaying in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Moments later, instead of an explosive public meltdown, the child simply exhales and leans their weight entirely against her. Why did she step in when the child wasn't doing anything wrong? What exactly did she see that the rest of us completely missed? Most of us are conditioned to wait for the explosion. We only start reacting when the crying begins and the situation has already escalated into an exhausting battle. We mistake silence for compliance, ignoring the silent emotional overload building underneath. But the secret to emotional regulation isn't about how quickly you can put out the fire. It's about knowing how to read the smoke. Today, we are decoding the invisible signal, the crucial 3-second window right before a tantrum, and how Japanese parents use a silent approach to completely rewire a child's nervous system before the storm even hits. The fatal mistake most of us make in discipline is confusing a child's sudden silence with obedience. We operate on a reactive timeline. We wait until the bad behavior, the screaming, the throwing, the collapsing on the floor, visibly occurs before we attempt to correct or comfort. But developmental neurobiology tells a completely different story. A tantrum is almost never a spontaneous act of rebellion. It is the blind spot of a massive cortisol buildup. When a child's sympathetic nervous system is hyperstimulated by noise, fatigue, or abrupt transitions, they lose access to their prefrontal cortex, entering a state of severe emotional dysregulation. By the time they are yelling, their logical brain is entirely offline. And this is where the cultural misunderstanding begins. What most parents don't realize is that before that first cry echoes across the room, the child's body always transmits a series of invisible SOS signals. The meltdown doesn't start with the scream, it ends with it. If you learn to look through this specific lens, you can actually diffuse the emotional bomb before the countdown finishes. To master this anticipation, Japanese parents rely on 3 specific principles that fundamentally change how they intervene. Let's look at the first concept that flips our reactive habits upside down. The first concept is deeply embedded in Japanese culture, known as kuki wo yomu, which literally translates to reading the air. In the context of parenting, this means assessing a child's emotional state not by what they verbally communicate, but by the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in their physical rhythm. Instead of waiting for a verbal complaint or a visible misbehavior, Japanese parents read the air by observing microscopic changes. It might be a child's breathing becoming slightly shallower, their gaze suddenly darting away, their little fists clenching, or an abrupt, unnatural silence falling over them in the middle of a chaotic, noisy environment. To understand why this observation is so critical, we have to look at the developmental neurobiology of a toddler. Children, especially those under 4 years old, do not have a fully integrated prefrontal cortex. They fundamentally lack the cognitive ability and the emotional vocabulary to stop and say, "Mom, the sensory input in this crowded train is overwhelming my nervous system, and I am starting to feel unsafe." They cannot articulate their dysregulation. Instead, their bodies speak for them. This reveals a profound contrast in cultural approaches. Reactive versus anticipatory parenting. In many Western cultures, we default to reactive parenting. We assume a quiet child is a good child. We go about our business, and we only intervene when the glass shatters, when the crying and throwing start. Japanese parenting, however, relies heavily on anticipation. They recognize that a child's sudden stillness in a highly stimulating environment is rarely obedience. It is almost always the calm before a severe neurological storm. So how do you apply this shift in your daily life? The next time you take your toddler to a busy public place, stop relying on preemptive verbal commands like, "Make sure you use your inside voice today." Instead, become a silent observer of their physical rhythm. Think back for a moment. Do you remember the last time your child went completely blank, staring into space just moments before letting out a piercing scream? What would have happened if you hadn't ignored that sudden quietness? What if you saw that stillness for what it truly was? A desperate, invisible SOS signal? Recognizing this invisible signal is only the first piece of the puzzle. The way you choose to react in the 3 seconds after you spot it is what determines whether the storm passes or hits full force. And this is exactly where our most common parental instincts lead us completely astray. Once you spot that invisible signal, the sudden stillness or the shallow breathing, what do you do next? In Western parenting, our immediate reflex is almost always verbal. We rush in with words. We ask, "What's wrong?" We command, "Use your words." Or we plead, "Please calm down. We are in public." But here is where the Japanese approach flips our instinct completely upside down. They practice what we might call silent co-regulation. Instead of using their voice to manage the child's behavior, they use their physical presence to manage the child's nervous system. When a Japanese mother senses a meltdown brewing, her intervention is incredibly subtle and almost entirely physical. She might simply tighten her grip on her child's hand, pick them up, offer a slow, rhythmic pat on the back, or immediately carry them to a quieter environment. No lectures, no rapid-fire questions. Just a calm, physical anchoring. Why does this silent approach work so effectively? Let's look at the science of a dysregulated brain. When a child's nervous system is pushed toward the fight or flight state, the language processing centers in their brain effectively shut down. They cannot process logic, reasoning, or even your most well-meaning questions. Have you ever noticed that the more you try to explain things to a dysregulated child, the louder they scream? The truth is, your words in that moment aren't water putting out the fire. They are gasoline. To a hyper-stimulated brain, verbal instructions are just more overwhelming noise. By choosing physical co-regulation over verbal correction, Japanese parents are bypassing the closed logic gate of the brain and speaking directly to the child's amygdala, the brain's alarm center. They understand that emotional safety is contagious through touch and rhythm, not through verbal reminders and rules. Your practical takeaway here is simple but profound. When you catch that invisible SOS signal, close your mouth and open your body language. Be the physical anchor, not the verbal instructor. However, this brings up a massive question, and it's an objection many Western parents immediately raise. If we are always stepping in to physically soothe them before they even cry, aren't we just spoiling them? Are we robbing them of the chance to learn independence? The answer to that lies in a deeply misunderstood cultural paradox, and it's the third and final piece of this puzzle. This brings us to the core cultural misunderstanding, centered around a uniquely Japanese psychological concept known as amai. Amai loosely translates to a person's deep instinctual desire to depend safely on the love and patience of another. In the context of a child on the verge of a meltdown, it means allowing them to completely lean on you without resistance or judgment. In many Western parenting paradigms, this idea is terrifying. We are culturally conditioned to push for early independence. We fear that if we hold, carry, or soothe a child who is whining, clinging, or acting out, we are spoiling them or rewarding bad behavior. Our default solution is often separation, such as a timeout, forcing the child into isolation so they can supposedly self-soothe and learn their lesson. But here is where the science of secure attachment shatters that fear. When a child is rapidly losing emotional control, their internal stress cup is completely overflowing. Forcing a toddler to self-soothe when they literally lack the neurological hardware to do so doesn't build independence. It just spikes their panic. To truly cool down, their amygdala must receive a definitive signal. I am safe and accepted even when I am at my worst and falling apart. Think about that for a second. What if a child's most dysregulated, difficult moment is exactly when they need your protective shield the most, rather than a moral lesson on self-reliance? Japanese parents embrace amai to offer a time in. Instead of pushing the child away to teach them a lesson, they pull them closer to absorb the shockwave. They understand a fundamental psychological paradox. Absolute dependence is not the enemy of independence. It is the prerequisite for it. By fully satisfying a child's need to depend on a secure emotional anchor, that need is met and eventually dissolves, leaving behind a deeply rooted, confident independence. Your practical application here is a complete mindset shift. Stop viewing a hug or a comforting physical hold during a highly frustrating moment as a concession or a reward for bad behavior. Treat it as throwing a safety cable to someone slipping off a cliff. When you connect these three elements, observing the invisible signal of kooky, choosing silent co-regulation, and embracing Amai as an anchor, you aren't just preventing a stressful public meltdown. You are doing something much greater. A tantrum is never a spontaneous act of defiance. It is a delayed cry for help from an overwhelmed nervous system. Japanese parents approach this not with iron-fisted discipline, but by staying one crucial step ahead. They read the invisible signals of kooky, observing the silence before the scream. They rely on silent co-regulation, choosing the grounding safety of a physical touch over the chaotic noise of verbal commands. And most importantly, they embrace the profound dependence of Amai, knowing that a child must feel completely safe falling apart before they can learn how to stand independently. When we change our timeline, when we choose observation over immediate reaction, we change the entire trajectory of our child's emotional development. We stop fighting the behavior and start soothing the brain. True discipline is not about how well you clean up the wreckage after the emotional storm has passed. It is about becoming still enough to read the wind before the dark clouds even gather. The next time your child goes unusually quiet in a chaotic room, what will you do? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe as we continue to decode the most profound psychological secrets of childhood. As we wrap up, I would love to hear how these concepts resonate with your own family, so please share your experiences in the comments below. Remember that every child is wonderfully unique, and while these cultural insights and developmental strategies are powerful, they are intended for educational purposes only. This video does not replace professional medical, psychological, or pediatric advice. Always trust your parental instincts and consult with a qualified specialist if you have ongoing concerns about your child's emotional development or nervous system regulation.